So this week at DevEd, we've heard compelling arguments for continued investment in education, emphasising the medium to long-term economic returns for families, communities and nations. Now, I'm not here to pendulum swing the conversation away from economic drivers across to a rights or values-based approach alone, as we know full well that these things go hand in hand. But when we consider the right of forcibly displaced populations to quality education in host countries or communities, as enshrined by Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, host countries' economic rationale run up against values and rights-based drivers, compromising our vision for what's possible for forcibly displaced children and the resilience of our societies more broadly. So in this light, today I want to focus specifically on refugee teachers within this forcibly displaced population group. We know they're the most compelling contributors to refugee children's learning, protection and well-being. And so I want to highlight global level developments and present two regional case studies relating to refugee teachers' exclusion from national education systems. To begin with, in 2019, UNHCR published Strategy 2030, in which the inclusion of forcibly displaced and refugee children in host community education systems is the underlying and rather ambitious goal. At the same time, especially in contexts where parallel and costly refugee education systems are the norm, and within which teaching is fulfilled by both qualified and tentative and spontaneous teachers, there is also a need for refugee teachers' inclusion in national education systems. In refugee hosting contexts such as Colombia or Kurdish Iraq, refugee teachers are understood as critical for psychosocial support and so-called social cohesion activities, just as much as they're respected for their pedagogical content knowledge and their socio-cultural contributions. But such positions are rare, and more often, refugee teachers are overlooked altogether. So at the UN Global Refugee Forum in 2019, out of 240 education-focused pledges, only 33 mentioned teachers or had the word teacher in the pledge. Only 6 of these pledges were actually focused on teachers. So this statistic motivated us to produce Refugee Teachers, the Heart of the Global Refugee Response, which was a compendium of policy insights which we launched at the next GRF, or Global Refugee Forum, in 2023. Across the 26 contributions from 48 authors, we confirmed that refugee teachers sustain learning, protection and hope for displaced children and youth, despite facing similar precarity, trauma and systemic exclusion as the students they teach. We learned from these contributions that refugee education policies often overlook refugee teachers, whereas we also know that they can be alternatively qualified, to borrow from Kirk and Winthrop, or transformative intellectuals, as Virali and colleagues have described them. Moreover, we learned that too many refugee teachers teach in expropriative conditions, and in host community and INGO-run systems, they experience what Ritesh Shah calls racialized hierarchies of management and control. So for another project, I've been attempting to visualize the professional conditions in which teachers affected by conflict and crisis work. So here I've coded in green, amber and red the extent to which refugee teachers are included or excluded from host community systems. So in green, we have Kurdish Iraq. The government there is transitioning Syrian refugee children from parallel schools based in the camps to the Kurdish education system. And within this transition, we have Syrian refugee teachers who are being trained and certified to accompany these children. And they're also being provided with contracts and compensation, just like their host community colleagues. In amber, we have Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where in line with the Djibouti Declaration, which aspires for the inclusion of refugee teachers in national pre-service education and continuous professional development, these teachers are trained, certified and paid, However, they still teach in parallel and temporary refugee-only schools. However, in Kuala Lumpur and Cox's Bazar, where my own research is based, teachers teach in non-formal and temporary settings, outside of the national system with short-term or no contracts and only incentive payments or no payments at all. And so it's on this note I want to dive into a couple of quick case studies. So for my first case study, I completed a mixed method study focused on the motivation and mental health of Rohingya refugee teachers in Cox's Bazar with a sample of 494 teachers across 4 different camps. What was really interesting is experiences of self-efficacy were the most powerful and significant factor in Rohingya teachers' motivation to teach. The next most significant was a sense of work satisfaction, which was defined by teachers' experiences of the conditions in which they worked, and teacher agency, or the extent to which teachers experience self-determination and autonomy in their work, was the third most compelling predictor of their motivation to continue teaching. It's also worth noting in these findings that Rohingya women were the most motivated to teach overall. For them, teaching had a somewhat emancipatory effect on their self-identity and self-reliance within the camps. And despite these teachers' exclusion, and based on the qualitative component of my study, we learned that the sense of anticipatory hope was identified as the most powerful and underlying motivation factor. For Rohingya teachers, education is about upholding their right to education. It's about preparing Rohingya children as future nation builders for their eventual repatriation to Myanmar, if that day ever comes. Now, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where many Rohingya also reside, we conducted a qualitative study for UNHCR, which involved interviews with 33 refugee teachers across 6 non-formal learning centres. And these centres also served Afghan, Myanmar, Iraqi, Somali, Syrian, and Yemeni undocumented migrants and refugees. For Somali and Myanmar ethnic minority teachers in particular, many were teaching in the shadows. They taught in parallel and clandestine learning centres. They told us that the act of teaching actually compounded their vulnerability, and that was a vulnerability that many forcibly displaced persons in Kuala Lumpur experienced. This is due to the fact that they can't obtain residency or work permits, and even for those who held UNHCR refugee cards, they told us that they felt vulnerable to arrest, exploitation, detention, and deportation. Moreover, teachers' qualifications and prior experiences in the classroom in their countries of origin were often not recognised. This prevented their access to certification, to professional development, and career progression. So, alongside their meagre or non-existent salaries, refugee teachers also talked about how their conditions contribute to psychosocial distress, their demotivation, and overall burnout. They felt undervalued at a time where they also strove to fulfil children's right to education and felt that they were very much educating against the odds. In Kuala Lumpur, teachers' motivation to teach was also about preparing children for future repatriation or third country resettlement. And this was heightened by the fact they had no right to work or learn in Malaysia. So when we reflect on the exclusion that's experienced in Cox's Bazar and Kuala Lumpur, I want us to look back at Kurdish Iraq, Kakuma, Colombia, and Chad, contexts that have made important strides to include refugee teachers within national training and certification, if not within their national schools. I believe they provide a blueprint for what's possible with comparably large refugee populations, but this also happens in settings with far greater resource constraints than what are experienced in Malaysia and Bangladesh. So to close, and in this regard, I really do think it's time to reimagine refugee education and to recognise the value and impact of refugee teachers' work in the Asia Pacific. Thank you.